Hello everyone, this is Scarzig and welcome to another Runeterra video. In today's video I'm going to be giving my opinions about why Pilfer is a toxic mechanic in the game currently and what we can do to fix it. So let's jump right in. With the introduction of Rising Tides, the Runeterra expansion that introduced Bilgewater, the player base also received an influx of random effects. Now, Riot Games has already posted an article justifying the inclusion of these random effects. It's a pretty good read. They already wrote about why randomness can be healthy if it is used correctly and can be a fine addition to the game overall. I'll have the link to that document in the description if you would like to read it in its entirety. I'll be using just a couple excerpts for the purposes of this video. Now, I am going to be focused on particularly just one mechanic that was introduced in the Bilgewater set, and that is Pilfering. And by Pilfering, I'm referring to the handful of cards that allow you to draw non-champions from the top of your opponent's deck or hand. These cards include the Pilfered Goods card, Yordle Grifter, Sleight of Hand, and the Black Market Merchant. Now, a mechanic like this creates opportunities for wild highlight reel moments in games, and I'm sure that you've all seen the Reddit posts and the Twitch clips showing just how crazy that it can be sometimes. Now, this mechanic, however, feels absolutely awful to be on the receiving end of. There are similar mechanics already in the game, such as Chempunk Pickpocket, right? But the key difference here is that this unit itself has to connect with the Nexus, making it a little bit more difficult to pull off. It does only generate spells, so the options that it can get are a bit narrower. And thirdly, it does create a copy of the spell. It doesn't take the spell away from the opponent. So being forced to play around your own removals and combat tricks alongside the opponents can put one under considerable pressure. But we've already experienced a meta, chock full of, say, Karmas and Insight of Ages, just generating tons of random spells. So we already know how that shakes out, often to the point where neither player can act or take any reasonable course of action because they just simply have no clue what to play around. And I think that the player base, especially the competitive scene, and not just for Runeterra either, has made it very clear that what they think of games being decided by randomly generated resources, and there is a reason that they call those losses getting Hearthstoned, right? So now I just want to return back to Pilfered Goods. I'm just going to use this as the preeminent representative of the pilfering mechanic. So in Riot's own words, the existence of this mechanic is predicated on the player opting for a playstyle that forces you to adapt a lot every game. You've made a choice to lean on that pillar of your skill, and your opponent has a good idea of what the outcome can be because they know all the cards in their deck and what you might have stolen. But both of these points are not true in practice. Now, decks that run these pilfering mechanics don't truly adapt their game plan to suit these new resources. They simply supplement their existing win conditions, or in some cases, these new resources will usurp them entirely. Furthermore, the unsung power of these cards is that, one, any extra resource is a plus, and these resources are going to be especially powerful on average, seeing as how they're good enough to be included in someone's deck in the first place. You'll notice with the similar mechanics of Insight of Ages or Chempunk Pickpocket, mostly just Insight of Ages rather, is it's just generated from the entire, list of spells that you could possibly get from the regions of your deck. So there is going to be a sliding scale of usefulness there, but Pilfer is specifically getting from deck. It's something that's deck viable, something that's very commonly played. So again, they're going to be stronger on average and more useful on average. And two, even if the player who pilfers gets resources that they can't use effectively or at all, they have still denied that resource to the opponent. Once again, Chempunk Pickpocket creates a copy of the spell, but Pilfer is taking cards directly from the deck. So now, 3, the Pilfering player has the benefit of now knowing about a handful of things that were in the opponent's deck, but now they no longer need to worry about. They get a little bit of intel about what you're running, but then they also don't need to worry because they know you aren't going to have the second copy of this or the third copy of that. So the player on the receiving end of the Pilfer has no idea that those resources are even missing. So Runeterra, like any CCG, is one where failing to account for or play around certain cards can mean the difference between victory and defeat. You may have had a rough idea of what your opponent may have gotten, but like the Chempunk pickpocket scenario, perfectly navigating the small possibility of your opponent gaining a copy of something that is truly devastating to your current line of play is a luxury that only the slowest decks can enjoy, because playing overcautiously to avoid the worst case scenario can often cost you a window of opportunity where pushing an advantage that you've earned up until that point could spell the victory for you. However, having a pilfered card destroy you in this scenario can make the player feel like they were punished for taking a risk that they felt was necessary, but where the negative outcome had such a small chance of occurring that there was actually no other realistic course of action, right? And so I can already hear a few of you saying Scarzig, but these scenarios are only going to happen every once in a great while, right? The players often will not focus on the games where the opponent pilfered unusable cards or where it put them a couple turns closer to drawing a key card that they really needed. And you would be somewhat correct. For every game where a random outcome matters, there will be another game where it does not. However, the average player will only recall the times where they were screwed over by Pilfer, right? And for every game where Pilfer gave them the lucky win, there's a player on the opposite end of that transaction who only remembers it as an utterly ridiculous loss. So we don't think of games in sets of 100. That's just not how the human brain works. This is just all based around the bias and statistic analysis of the human mind in general. And we cannot directly perceive the variance potentially balancing itself out over time. So by its very nature, Pilfer can only create negative moments, right? But there is still hope for these cards, and it's actually a very small change that I'm suggesting here that would have huge implications for most of the negative scenarios that I've just described, right? So here's what it is. Simply make the pilfered cards open information. When you pilfer a card from the opponent's deck, those cards are now face up in your hand so that both players know what was taken and now what actually needs to be played around and what's missing, right? Now, this isn't, of course, going to eliminate the cases where somebody casts pilfered goods at the last minute as a Hail Mary to get that crazy card that they might need to get a lethal and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. That's still going to be the highlight crazy moments that, you know, a card like this is obviously intended to achieve. However, the cards that are taken earlier in the game or over the course of the mid-game can now be properly accounted for so that both players can now make use of Riot's touted pillar of skill from their article, adaptability, rather than blindly wandering into cards that could make or break an otherwise close game. The player on the receiving end can now account for certain resources now being absent, as opposed to relying on a key card that may never come, right? If it happens to be your deck's win condition or something else that's very important to your strategy or something that's going to help you come back into the game, and now you know that that card is missing, then maybe you at least have the option to concede and save yourself a little bit of time. You still kind of lost to Pilfer, but it gives the player once again a little bit more agency in that transaction. And again, being able to appropriately react to these additional options that your opponent is generating is just better for the game overall. Because now the Pilfering player now has to ask themselves how to incorporate the threat of their ill-gotten gains into their strategy. How do you best employ a card that the opponent knows is coming, right? So these bluffs and mind games are something I feel wholeheartedly captures the roguish charm of Bilgewater. If you read that article about randomness and some of the designs in Bilgewater, you know that Riot Games was very keen on capturing that flavor of Bilgewater. It's a very roguish, seedy pirate town, and having again some of these bluffs and trying to trick your opponent to come out on top is something that again really captures that flavor, and this is just a small change that'll make these cards operate in a much healthier faction. So I think that's really all I have to say, and thank you for listening for this long, and let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.